Okay, good afternoon and welcome everyone. I'm Andrew Jones, the chair of the Center for Chinese Studies, and I'm very pleased to welcome you all, and I'm going to give you a chunk of official language for the moment, to the third Elvira Kwong Siam Lim Memorial Lecture in Chinese Studies. This is an annual endowed lecture series, and it was made possible through a generous gift to the Center for Chinese Studies by Mrs. Lim's family to honor her dedication to scholarly exchange. With this endowment, we bring one eminent scholar to Berkeley each fall semester to present a public lecture, meet with faculty and graduate students, and generally foster scholarly exchange and debate amongst colleagues. The namesake of this now 3-year-old series, Elvira Kwong Siam Lim, was born in Shantou, Guangdong Province in 1928. She was sent to Hong Kong to attend high school and later received her undergraduate degree from the University of Hong Kong. After receiving her PhD from the University of Hawaii, Mrs. Lim took a position in the biology department of the newly established Chinese University of Hong Kong, where she remained until her retirement in 1989. She passed away in Oakland, California on March 27, 2006. In addition to this lecture series, Mrs. Lim's family has established an endowed graduate fellowship competition in her name to reward academic excellence in Chinese studies and further bolster the growing community of China scholars across campus that the Center for Chinese Studies serves. So we thank her, of course, and her family for making this ongoing series possible. With that out of the way, I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Prasenjit Duara. I'm very happy to welcome him here to Berkeley. He's an old colleague and old friend. Prasenjit is currently the Raffles Professor of Humanities and Director of Research in Humanities and Social Sciences at the National University of Singapore. He's also Emeritus Professor of History at the University of Chicago. I think it's safe to say that he's one of the leading China historians of his generation, of his cohort, but also, and very importantly, in terms of both empirical research and historiography, he's one of the China historians who's done most to challenge the nation form and the idea that history ought to be restricted to the nation form. And of course, famously, he's rescued history from the nation in his book from 1995. But among his other works are an early book on culture, power, and the state, Rural North China, 1900 to 1942, which won the Fairbank Prize of the HA and the Levinson Prize of the AAS. So it's a double threat. More recently, there was a work on Manzhou Guo, entitled Sovereignty and Authenticity, Manchu Kuo and the East Asian Modern. Another volume entitled The Global and the Regional in China's Nation Formation. And his work has also included an edited volume on the large theme, the large world historical theme of decolonization. More recently, Professor Duara is working on 2 major projects, one entitled Transcendence in a Secular World, Religion and Modernity in the Non-Abrahamic Traditions of Asia, a part of which I believe he'll be presenting tomorrow at Stanford. So if you're interested in that ongoing project, you might want to journey down to Palo Alto and hear what he has to say tomorrow afternoon. Is it? Yes, so. Great. Yeah. And a second project, which is also at present unfolding on Hong Kong as a kind of flashpoint, culturally, historically, and otherwise, of the Cold War. Both works that we'll look forward to with great anticipation. Today's lecture, however, is entitled, thank you, Chinese Reforms in Historical and Comparative Perspective. We also, actually today we have something of a double threat as well, in that we also have a very eminent discussant to respond to and then moderate the discussion of Prasenjit Duara's lecture afterwards. And this is, of course, our very own Wenqing Ye from the Department of History. Wenqing Ye is the director of the Institute of East Asian Studies, the Richard H. and Laurie C. Morrison Professor in History here at Cal. And she is also the author of numerous studies. I won't rehearse them all because she doesn't look like she wants me to. But I'm sure many of you are familiar with them. I'll just mention that the most recent study by Professor Ye is entitled Shanghai Splendor, and it's an urban history of Shanghai that considers the nature of Chinese capitalism and middle-class society in a century of contestation between colonial power and nationalistic mobilization. I'll leave it at that for now, and welcome our guest, Professor Duara. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you very much, Andrew. It is a pleasure to be back in Berkeley. I have spoken here many times and always had very engaging exchanges. There are many things I would have liked to say about your introduction, which were fun. But we don't have time since this is a relatively long paper, and I want to get through it soon. But I have noticed that since certainly the beginning and even the middle of the time I've been coming to Berkeley, there's been quite a Sinicization of Berkeley. I see all these buildings with Chinese names like Li Ka-shing and Tantika and all these others, and now the lectures. So that's all for the good, and I'm very pleased to see that. Anyway, this paper on reforms in historical and comparative perspective was prepared as a keynote address to commemorate the 30th anniversary of the reforms at a conference principally of economists in Beijing. And it was sponsored by a variety of groups in PETA and in the Ministry of Finance and Asian Development Bank. I don't think originally they planned to hear a historian, but for some reason the economists couldn't show up, and so they mobilized me from the region. And initially I was quite worried. I mean, what can I say to economists? They're quite self-contained in their own world, in their mathematical universe. But it turned out that it was not hard to please them with some history because they didn't know much history. But I think it'll be harder to please you since you guys know a lot of history. So let's go from there. So as a historian of China with an interest in development issues in other Asian societies, particularly India, I will consider the Chinese reforms from a largely implicit comparative perspective. I included the title Comparative to bring in people like Professor Bardhan, who is, of course, a very well-known economist who's worked on China and India as well. But it's more implicit than explicit. I'm sure he'll find out what to do with it, but it's largely a historical perspective. I will argue that the success of Chinese reforms have had much to do with both long-term, late imperial historical traditions, as well as with the legacy of socialism. Both of these factors may seem somewhat counterintuitive, but they make good sense from a comparative historical perspective, which can isolate the relatively unique features of Chinese developments. At the same time, I will also argue that the fundamental problems of reform faced by the populace, especially in the rural areas, are also connected to the historical features of Chinese state-society relations. The prospects for further improvement of livelihood of the populace is closely connected with the problem of the relationships between local state and society. One of the things Andrew said was that there was an old book of mine called Culture, Power and the State, and I too have ignored that book as my interest developed in different directions for many years, but in this paper I have returned to some of the themes of that, and hopefully have tried to expand some of the ideas, especially of the cultural nexus of power. There are three simple terms in my argument that we have to keep in mind. One, the central government. Two, the local authorities or the party at the provincial and sub-provincial levels, in particular the sub-provincial levels, and the common people or local society. Although the role of the central government is hugely important, for purposes of this paper, I will spend most of my time considering the latter two, especially the role of entrepreneurship in rural society. But first, a few comments on the central leadership and direction of the reforms. In hindsight, the reforms since 1978 may be comparable to the reforms unleashed by the Meiji Restoration in Japan, initiated over 100 years before in 1868. In both cases, they were initiated by reformist leadership factions that one, I wasn't planning on Marybeth Berry to be here, but anyway, we'll go with it. That won crucial reformist leadership factions that won crucial political battles within the state. In both cases, the reforms were proposed incrementally. Indeed, in the Meiji case, the early years of the Restoration were seen by many of its supporters as a restoration of traditional historical political relationship, where the emperor was expected to strengthen and rule Japan according to historical principles. Once launched, the changes began to grow exponentially, and their tangible results empowered and required the reformers to pursue the path of change, both to continue the successes and overcome new obstacles and demands. Finally, in both cases, the highest level of leadership in the new government took bold steps, particularly after the growth of oppositional demands in the first 15 years of reform. In particular, some of the important leaders of the Meiji Restoration, such as Ito Hirobumi, ushered in new institutional reforms while suppressing more radical democratic movements such as the Jiuminken Undo, or in Chinese, the Ziyou Minjian Yundong, in the early 1880s. In some ways, Ito's role is perhaps comparable to Deng Xiaoping's leadership, particularly after the setback to reforms presented by radical movements in China in the late 1980s. The Southern Expedition of Deng in 1992 certainly renewed the reformist energies in China. In both cases, an oligarchic form of control was able to regroup after major challenges and adjust the direction of reform. And one of the things that we might consider is how many of these elements involved in this narrative may be actually a product of East Asian patterns of political development. One seemingly unique dimension from the central perspective in China is that the rise of China has until now been relatively peaceful. Historically, state building and expansion, as Charles Tilly told us, have been accompanied by foreign wars. And of course, Meiji Japan was no exception to this. Military expansion in Japan was, as elsewhere, also a means to rally a population undergoing traumatic shifts. In the People's Republic of China, one of the most important leadership strategies that developed during the reforms was to delink politics from economics. Domestically in this regard, the PRC followed a different path of reform from the erstwhile Soviet Union as well. There, the almost simultaneous reforms of political and economic systems produced results that were much more volatile than those in China, where economic changes were implemented incrementally and political changes occurred much more slowly, leading to a more stable pattern of reforms. Less noticed is that a similar pattern of delinking politics from economics has also been adopted in China's international relations, or at least until recently. The so-called peaceful rise of China has entailed putting difficult political problems, for instance with countries like Japan, Taiwan, India, or Southeast Asia, on the back burner and not permitting them to interfere with economic relations. Consequently, with the enormous growth of China's trading volumes with these Asian economic partners, the stakes are much higher on both sides to discourage recklessly pushing political issues. While this is by no means the end of political problems between these nation states, the incentives for bilateral and regional cooperation have grown. Thus, when I discuss the social and historical conditions of reform in China below, we need to keep in mind the vision and strategy of the central government leadership as an underlying enabling condition. The other two terms of my analysis are local government and rural people. I focus on local and especially the rural sector because of my earlier research in that area, and partly because I believe that the rural sector was the driving force of reforms during the 1980s and 90s. Much of the success of Chinese reforms came from the countryside, initially from the decollectivization of farms, the rise of agricultural incomes, and from subsidiary rural enterprises, or fuye. Subsequently, much of the success of the reforms stemmed from the tens of thousands of township and village enterprises, TVEs, that dotted the Chinese countryside. After 1994, large-scale integrated agricultural firms also began to appear on the scene, which until recently also evolved out of the TVEs and other rural enterprises. The reforms proceeded by unleashing the energies of, firstly, the local authorities. So that's level 2. This was expressed most clearly in the policy of every tub on its bottom, or zifu yingkui, which had an electrifying effect in local society. It created incentives for each local unit, or tanwei, to increase its economic product because it could keep a larger share of the product. If we simply focus on this factor, we can see two important historical dimensions to it. In the first place, the policy took effect within the mobilizatory apparatus of the Maoist period. Second, it has to be understood within the longer-term effects of state-society relations from the late imperial period, especially the Qing. One of the most powerful factors contributing to the success of the Chinese Communist Revolution was the organizational structure or the apparatus of mobilization instituted by the communists. Although it was based upon the Leninist idea of the Communist Party's cell as the nucleus of mass organizations, the Maoists adapted and developed it sufficiently to Chinese conditions so that it became one of the most powerful instruments of political mobilization in the world. Am I going too fast? Oh, sorry, little fast, huh?
No, that's fine. That's fine.
Indeed, as I will discuss later, to call it a mere instrument is to belittle its power because it was central to the remaking of identity and society or the cultural nexus in China. In this apparatus of mobilization, the CCP was located strategically at every level of organization, down to the neighborhood, if not family, so that the politics and initiatives of the party could be translated into action across the depth and breadth of the society, although, of course, with uneven results. Many of these policies were conducted through the well-known campaign of mobilization, such as during the collectivization drive or the Cultural Revolution. But most initiatives were also implemented through more everyday, small-scale mobilization, whether to persuade production team members to join brigades or to dissuade peasants from demanding bride price. In the command economy, this mobilization ability gave the local authorities considerable power to mobilize and deploy labor for and other resources for production whenever they were needed. Few people have noted how the mobilization apparatus was utilized, perhaps unself-consciously, during the reform period. If one went to a provincial level administrators' meet in the 1990s, one might see the representatives of the counties and prefectures arrayed and ranked by their production figures and quotas in a great hall. They were expected to display their successes and failures in a campaign-style public performance so as to motivate cadres to greater achievements, since distinction and reward were gained through achieving higher production targets. This applies to this day as well. Here we see the legacy of socialist mobilization, where struggle is replaced by competition. Indeed, even the vocabulary of the correct road and line. This is from a thesis undertaken by a student at Chicago by the name of Stephen Hirschler, who argued that the correct road and line was transferred from the goal of struggle to competitive production. Further, the ability of the party state to provide better conditions for capital investment than most other developing countries is tied to the ability of the party state to mobilize labor and other resources effectively and with low transaction costs. Socialism provided the state with the organizational capacity to mobilize the devolutionary policy. This is very Californian. Secondly, the Qing period was characterized by what Max Weber called a prebendary system. The system represented a hybrid or intermediate stage between a modern bureaucracy and feudal relations. Unlike a modern rationalized bureaucracy, the official, in this case the county magistrate, is not fully salaried by the state. Rather, he fulfills a quota to be delivered to the higher levels, while the remainder is utilized for his local administrative expenses. He doesn't want to go out. At the same time, of course, the magistrate is appointed for a limited tenure by the state and is subject to its laws and norms. I think it's the food. While the reasons for utilizing the structure is different in each case, the devolutionary policy of each tub on its own bottom, or Zifu Yingkui, is structurally quite similar to the Qing prebendary system. To be sure, the capitalist nature of production and greater organizational capacity produces a different dynamic in the current system. But the structural resemblance is significant because it produces the same problem in both eras. the problem of surveillance by higher authorities and or local communities over local authority structures highly motivated to increase their revenues and income. I now turn to the third term, or the role of the common people in the reforms. The reforms implemented by the central government in 1978 unleashed not only the initiatives of local authorities, but also the entrepreneurial spirit of the people. The most important historical condition here is the millennium-long entrepreneurial tradition of Chinese local society, beginning with the commercial revolution of the Tang Song transition. As we know, one of the most important conditions of entrepreneurship in late imperial China was the robust system of markets that integrated much of the empire vertically under interlinked metropolitan cities. This has been ably analyzed by G.W. Skinner and Shiba Yoshinobu. Another historical expression of local economic activity is the pervasive institution of contracts. Anyone who has done research on local history in China is familiar with how China is a society of contracts. There are contracts for every type of activity, bringing two parties together in a transaction, and they represent a form of customary law. Usually the format of the contract is quite simple. It lists the names and identities of the two parties, the terms of the exchange, the equally indispensable middlemen or middleman, 中间人. The middlemen often represent people with face or authority in local society and are known to both parties. I want to urge us to look at the institutions of the local economy and entrepreneurship in the context of what I have earlier called the cultural nexus of power. This is from my first book, in rural North China. Economic practices and institutions were firmly embedded in the local cultural nexus. From at least the 16th century, contracts were authorized by the nexus of ritual, lineage, gods, and ancestors, and practically mediated by guilds, relatives, middlemen, and village leadership. Markets were frequently held at the time of temple festivals and fairs, and in North China, temples became the centers of economic activities. Several professional or guild-like communities were also organized under a tutelary deity, and merchants worshipped Guanti, an emperor-wide protector god, in addition to Caishen, the god of wealth. The authority of religious deities and temple management committees were frequently invoked or brought in to mediate contractual issues. In other words, the trust necessary for economic activity was enabled by the norms and authority structures of local society more than an abstract set of laws. Indeed, scholars have drawn our attention to types of contract where it might be difficult for anything other than spiritual authority to enforce or arbitrate. The so-called tomb contracts, where the successors of the deceased entered into a contract with the god of earth to occupy the gravesite, reached the height of its popularity during the Song period, but it actually continued until the 20th century. In Valerie Hanson's discussion of a contract from the Song, the contract was engraved on iron, although most ordinary people had it on wood, which means it doesn't remain now, and resembled the ordinary land contract. Among other things, it mentioned the dimensions of the plot, the price, and the witnesses present. It also mentioned that should the spirit return to harass the living, the spirit would be tied up and handed to the lord of the rivers, Longwang. It seems clear from such a contract that the framework for its adjudication was not the state, but rather the realm of society and culture. To be sure, the Qing courts accepted many of the norms of secular customary law and frequently upheld the normative claims of local society when it was forced to make a judgment. But most contracts were not legally mediated, and the Qing played what we might think of as a night watchman role of not interfering in local society, the Wu Wei state, right? As we know, as such, its legal role was consistent with the general role it played in local society. Is there some way we can have these doors closed now? I think the bird is gone. It's still up there, but he's settled in. He's listening to my paper. So it's a little cool. Its legal role was consistent with the general role it played in local society. The size, as we know, of the imperial bureaucracy was very small in relation to the society, so it had to rely on an indigenous model of local government without requiring too much of imperial government. By the 19th century, there was one representative of the bureaucracy governing about 300,000 to 400,000 people. The imperial state was able to govern by delegating the symbolic power of government, while at the same time keeping public funds out of reach of those to whom it delegated this power. As is well known, the literati or degree-holding gentry, the shenshi, possessed the right and symbolic power to distinguish themselves as elite and informal leaders of local society by their formal access to officialdom. So the access becomes this important resource, right? The gentry society model involved the entrustment of an ideologically state-oriented elite with the imprimatur of state power without expending fiscal and political power on social maintenance. Of course, it has its costs as well. The night watchman role of the imperial state with regards to customary law was similar. Here, critical to trust in customary law was a normative commonality, a cultural nexus. As such, the cultural nexus was also a significant means of communication and negotiation with imperial orthodoxy, which sought to encompass and superscribe many of the gods and values of popular culture. Some of you may have read my essay on Kwanti, the god, where I try to describe how superscription takes place. It is certainly true that these practices and institutions were dependent on society of personal relationships rather than an impersonal society bounded by abstract laws. But there were resources in the cultural nexus that were able to considerably extend the range of these activities. Networks of temple communities and the large-scale lineages in South China often frame their range. David Four has shown the importance of rituals and the role of people sanctioned by ritual to a variety of economic activities, including contracts and claims to land ownership, particularly among lineages and genealogies. I've studied self-managing irrigation communities in North China that extended over many villages and markets, which drew water from the same river. Cooperation and conflict management across the river basin was conducted in a segmentary mode of organization focused on temples at different levels of activity. Thus, different levels of the Loan temple structure paralleled water and water sharing and work sharing organizations. The coordination of different scales of activity was conducted at the corresponding level of the Longwang temples, and decisions and activities were sanctified and sanctioned by rituals conducted at the temple. What about the limitations of such a local economy to the modern needs of generating large-scale accumulation of capital? How would it be possible to scale up economic activity without a banking system and developed financial institutions? How could economic activities go beyond interpersonal or intergroup relations? Before we accept that the cultural nexus was not suited for such scaled-up activities, we should consider the role of such groups as the Ningpo or Shanxi bankers, which had business interests spread across large stretches of China. I'm also very interested in the Southeast Asian Chinese merchants, who, of course, employ this whole strategy of generating fairly large resources of capital. For instance, Shanxi bankers were very important in the late 19th century when Mongolia was being settled by the Chinese farmers. Most of the agricultural development was not undertaken by modern banks, but by these Shanxi bankers. It'd be interesting to explore the economic and cultural practices they employed to extend credit and trust over large areas. What happened to the cultural nexus of power in Republican China? As I sought to demonstrate in my first book, the modernizing state sought to penetrate rural society and generate resources for modernization and repayment of imperialist debt through the extraction of rural resources. The new state was no longer laissez-faire or minimalist. At the same time, however, its penetration into local society had a largely destructive effect upon the cultural nexus, without being able to create an alternative mode of affiliating state and society. Local authorities now sought to destroy or appropriate temple properties to create modern schools and pay for new police and administrative institutions. Under the normative nexus, communities used to undertake collective and government-ordered functions, such as self-taxation, through what I call protective brokerage. These community protective organizations could negotiate with governments and outside demands quite effectively. After the Republic, such protective brokerages began to disappear as increasingly government demands and pressures made it unviable for community leaders to lead. Only very predatory government agents and local bullies or evil gentry were able to undertake the extraction of resources. Ultimately, local leadership, community norms, and religious authority in the cultural nexus were eroded by state-building activities that developed no means to supervise and control those who were making new and heavy demands on the society. The supervision of local authorities, whether from below or above, has been a long-term problem in late imperial society. Because of the new demands of modernization in the 20th century, the problem reached unprecedented levels. With the establishment of the People's Republic of China, this apparently narrow administrative problem was subsumed under the revolutionary effort to rebuild state-society ties during its first 30 years in a new type of cultural nexus between state and society. Before turning to this effort, let's return to the general revolutionary preconditions, the short-term factors that contribute to the success of the post-1978 reforms in China. So this section is called Socialist China. During the socialist period, China had very good indices for health, education, including technical education, and levels of livelihood of ordinary people that few third world countries could match. Chinese socialism had provided suitable conditions and training for the labor force, which was very beneficial to the early periods of reforms. The second precondition concerns the mobilization apparatus that I discussed. China has a strong party structure with deep roots in rural and urban society. While some of the mobilization campaigns, such as the Great Leap Forward, were destructive and wasteful, we have also seen that in its ability to mobilize labor and resources on an everyday basis, elsewhere have called this socialist primitive accumulation, were destructive and wasteful. We have also seen its ability to mobilize labor and resources on an everyday basis in the reform period that appears to cut transaction costs for business. This is related to the third point, which is the strong state structure in China. Compared to many developing countries, the Chinese state has the capacity to make hard decisions, for instance, regarding infrastructural development. In other developing countries, many policy decisions often have different interests, making both political and rent-seeking claims on those resources. Of course, these interests exist in China as well, but the relative capacity of local authorities to implement its decision is greater. Finally, I want to point to another revolutionary factor that created a basis for economic development: land reform. Land reform took place not only in China, but all across East Asia in the aftermath of World War II. Land reform is notoriously difficult to undertake because landed powers often control societies and states. In Japan and Korea, it was enabled by the US occupation regimes, unconnected to landed powers, and in Taiwan, it was undertaken by the US-backed KMT after its loss of China. In the PRC, it was an extraordinarily violent upheaval that was deemed to be necessary for revolutionary transformation. Land reform is an important condition for social transformation, but not because it produces economic development. Indeed, because it transfers land to individual small households, these farms, or small farm sizes, these farms are severely constrained in their ability to sustain increased productivity. More importantly, land reform clears the local power structure in which a developmental or reforming state can extend its authority. The relatively high developmental indices produced in China during the socialist period were made possible by the replacement of the older landed authority and the crisis in the cultural nexus of power. In the pre-reform socialist period, Maoist state was able to build back the destroyed relations between state and society. I'm sorry, this is going more slowly than I had hoped. The Chinese Revolution sought to remake society and the human being from below and within. That is, by generating a certain degree of voluntarism from the people. This included not only indoctrination to the ritual theater of rebirth, in the mass criticism and struggle campaigns, but also a mammoth reproduction and resignification of peasant culture. To be sure, this kind of cultural nexus has to be significantly different from the earlier model because of the more activist and intrusive nature of state power, which needs to orient and even manipulate culture to its ends. At the same time, the culture of the people could not be entirely ignored or totally rejected. The Communist Party and its cultural activists had to tread a delicate line between popular culture and party ideology, a new meaning to walking on two legs. Right? Indeed, many scholars are persuaded the party state was able to walk this line quite successfully until the Great Leap Forward. Rural folk, in particular, were most happy when they received land, were able to engage in sideland production for the market, participate in the cultural life of the village and market, and cooperate with each other in ways that were optimum from them. These policies were implemented in the 40s and 50s, and it is also when the party was able to mobilize peasants effectively. The subsequent destruction or abolition of private plots, market, and religious life was also associated with disenchantment with communist policies. The over-ritualization of communist projects, such as the speak bitterness and self-criticism sessions, the deification of Mao, etc., and manipulation of new cultural repertoire, especially during the Cultural Revolution, contributed to the upsetting of this balance. By the time of reforms in 78, there was considerable exhaustion from the excesses of the CR in urban and rural society. However, partly because of residency laws, the hukou laws, preventing rural migration and limited nature of market forces, rural social communities, although deprived of many of their older institutions, remained largely intact at the time. Production teams and brigades were built upon neighborhoods and villages and often came to be inhabited by older communal structures. As such, it is not surprising to see the return of so many historical type activities related to local and customary practices in China right during the early periods of reforms, right through. At the time when the household responsibility system was introduced in China in 1981, people had access to resources from three different systems. One, the socialist period legacies of elements of the imperial period culture of entrepreneurship, particularly within the family. Elements of the imperial period, the socialist period legacies of development and community, including the Danwei, and the new shoots of commercial opportunity. Many people in both rural and urban society combine these elements in a bricolage form that I call creative entrepreneurialism, in opposition to a more systemic or legally based entrepreneurialism. When I first went to China in the mid-80s, I was struck by something for which there was really no proper name. It was the ingenious intertwining of socialist and capitalist modes of organization to be found within a single entity. Waiting for buses, I saw the large, crowded, and slow government buses that were a challenge to ride. At the same time, I also noticed small minibuses darting around the large buses that, for a slightly higher fee, would transport you more conveniently and efficiently, if not more safely, to your destination. Upon inquiring about these minibuses, I discovered that they were managed by quasi-private groups who belonged to the larger socialist bus company, the Danwei. This group would lease the minibuses and run them for a profit. Presumably, there was some kind of profit sharing between the Danwei and the small group. It was the first time I understood the principle of each tub on its own bottom. Subsequently, I began to notice this creative entrepreneurship everywhere. Schools that had to provide milk for the students developed a side business in producing milk cartons for a profit. And we can go on. History departments could only produce not much for the market, unfortunately, I noticed. Economic departments in some of the famous universities could even create companies that they might list in the stock market. The Shanghai phenomenon, or taking the plunge, among the professional middle classes represented a good example of this entrepreneurialism. While one spouse retained the job and the safety net of the Danwei with its housing and health benefits, the other would plunge into the marketplace. Now, post-socialist rural China. Informal entrepreneurial activities were just as prevalent in the countryside, and post-reform growth was driven significantly by rural society. The household responsibility system that, it should be remembered, brought land use and not absolute property rights to household, brought an initial spike in agricultural incomes, but the small size of individual farms made them inefficient. However, rural non-agricultural enterprises grew at a phenomenal rate after the early 1980s. Private enterprises, chuanye, based on fuye or sideline occupations, including the red hat firms, or the kwahu firms, who acquired collective licenses for private businesses, took off, also operating on an official Danwei basis. Commercialized sideline occupations, of course, been a feature of the rural Chinese economy since at least the Ming-Qing times, and it's possible to see these developments as a revival of older patterns. Meanwhile, the collectively owned township and the TVEs also flourished. Their share of industrial production rose from 16 to 34%, from 85 to 94. Since the late 1990s, the activities of these TVEs have been increasingly replaced in rural areas by small-scale trade and private industrial and agricultural firms. Much of this, I submit, was made possible not by state or legal structures, but by the cultural nexus, which, among other things, fostered institutional networks of trust and reciprocity, or what is now known as social capital. As is well known, the nucleus of rural China is the family. It was the basic unit of society and culture. Generations of scholarship have revealed that the rural family may be studied from at least three perspectives. I won't go into that now, but I'm thinking especially of the formulation created, originally developed by the Japanese legal scholar Shiga Shuzo, called the common budget and the common property group, the family to be seen as a common budget and property group. For our purposes here, it is this model of the family constituted around an estate, group, or budget that is most relevant. Briefly, in this view, the family is a highly elastic entity built around either a concentrated or a dispersed estate, a group living either under the same roof or dispersed locations, and a family economy or budget that may be inclusive or exclusive. Myron Cohen conducted an in-depth study of this family structure in Taiwan, but we can identify the flexible and diversified portfolio of peasant families in North China and elsewhere too. While this elasticity may have been most useful for upwardly mobile families, entrepreneurial families, it had advantage for subsistence families as well, who sent out sons beyond the group and the estate, but retained an inclusive economy with their remittances. Sadly, young daughters could also be sold, that is excluded from the family economy, to retain the estate. It is doubtless this elasticity of family structure that enabled the periodic and recent outmigration waves from the villages. It permitted rural families to develop entrepreneurial traditions, to flourish, and at the very least, to survive. In the absence of detailed studies, we may speculate that it was also behind the boom of peasant enterprise, fouye, that took place through 1980s and even the TVEs of the 1990s. The widespread resurgence of folk religion and temple communities, particularly in post-Mao rural China, is also important in this context. Neglecting for a moment, I'll return to it, the rich religious life of coastal villages, the recent works of anthropologists such as Adam Chow and Jun Jing in North China suggest that simply having a temple produces considerable voluntarism, models of organizational extension into the secular realm, and leadership opportunities. It bespeaks a need for residents of these ascriptive communities to search out a sacred arena in which peasant values are forged, reproduced, and diffused. In these cases, the temple community seems to return as an ideal node in the cultural nexus of power. The return, of course, involves the leveraging of many more resources, political levels, and ideas in contemporary China. But the resemblance to the older cultural nexus is uncanny. Thus, Adam Chow shows how the leadership of the villages he studied in Shanpei often coincides with the temple leadership. In his case, the temple leadership undertook a slew of community initiatives, including the building of new schools, reforestation projects, income-generating schemes, and protecting the temple community and villages from entrepreneurial and even predatory officials, representatives, in addition to addressing the religious needs of the people. The negotiatory role of the nexus is also evident. Thus, while popular religion is increasingly tolerated nowadays, only the Buddhist and Taoist institutions can be legally established. But what Adam Chow discusses in the Heilong Wang Dahui temple in Shanpei had no licensed monks or priests and provided myriad spirit medium, geomantic, and healing services to the community. The manner in which the leadership of this temple community got around the interdiction was by feting the cadres at the temple festival, where the temple was described simply as Taoist. So it was this camouflage of Taoism for everybody, right? You could do what you like. And its engagement in a variety of development functions was, of course, displayed, doing all these secular things. It is, of course, in the southeast and coastal regions of China that we get the best evidence of rural entrepreneurship during the first 20 years of the reforms and its close link to the cultural nexus. The study of coastal Fujian, the southeast, and the Wenzhou model in particular has become a virtual cottage industry in China's studies of the reform period. As Kenneth Dean, Mei Fei Yang, Stephen Feuchtwang, Wang Mingming, and others have argued, in these regions, networks of village and lineage temples have formed a virtual second tier of local government, providing services, raising funds, mobilizing entire communities to participate in collective rituals. Through their ritual and social activities, local elites have reclaimed the space of local society from the state, thus restoring a trend that began in Ming-Qing times. The cultural nexus here is, of course, far more complex than seen in the imperial or republican times. Kenneth Dean argues that, quote, successive state institutional initiatives encountered an incomprehensibly complex ground of local and transregional ritual, cultic, voluntary, kin, pseudo-kin groups, regional alliances, and flows of capital, idea, images, and practices from throughout the Asian trading network. This is, of course, true of Southeast China. Yet he is quick to state that this nexus should not be perceived in terms of a Western ideological lens of a civil society resisting state intrusion. Rather, it represents the kind of accommodation and negotiation that we historically associate with the cultural nexus. Closer studies of the Wenzhou model suggest that a good deal of entrepreneurship in the region came from strong local community ties and connections. In the mid-90s, Wenzhou had 130,000 rural households who worked in household production and trade. In the late 80s and 90s, 95% of the total capital for these groups were provided by so-called underground financial organizations, such as money clubs, specialized financial households, money shops, and autonomous local credit unions with floating interest rates. That is to say, these were supposedly official ones with fixed government interest rates, but they just charge market prices. To be sure, some of these informal arrangements could be quite usurious and also produce social problems. Behind this kind of entrepreneurship are very strong ties between local entrepreneurs and the local state authority in Wenzhou, which for historical reasons happen to have a more independent stance towards the central government. I won't go into the reasons for that. These authorities engaged in a kind of protective brokerage that permitted peasant entrepreneurs to flourish in the sideline silk and textile industries while profiting themselves handsomely as well. Let's get that straight. Kelly Tsai, who has worked on rotating credit societies in the region, also finds that this historically pervasive local institution has recently become particularly important for women, in part because men have greater access to formal and institutional credit. She notes that informal credit is built upon important foundations of social capital, requiring fairly tight-knit groups of people, often based on kin and temple association, grassroots organizations, and networks that assume reciprocity, trust, and most importantly, financial credibility, which is, of course, true also of the recent microcredit schemes all over the world. A critical legacy of the socialist structure that contributed to the re-emergent cultural nexus in many villages is the institution of collective ownership of land. The household responsibility system introduced the right of peasants to a certain portion of the collectively owned village land. As such, it is a right to land use. Household rights remained closely tied to the village collectivity and permitted rural people to maintain a sense of belonging even while they engaged in risky entrepreneurial activities or simply migrated to the cities for work. As services provided by the state diminished in the reform era, the village became the corporate body charged with the moral responsibility for provision of employment and welfare. The success of TVEs during the 1990s and the institution of village elections and self-governments is partially a testimony to the emergence of the village as a corporation with a moral charge. State legislation in the mid-1990s enabled vertical integration of private agribusinesses, which were permitted to consolidate land holdings, scale up production, apply capital and technology, and produce efficiencies in storage and transportation of agricultural products. Many of these businesses also developed from TVEs or from successful private entrepreneurs within agriculture. These firms leased land from farmers who have different types of relations with them. Some are agricultural laborers, while others are tenants. But in all cases, collective land rights allowed rural residents to resist acquisition of their lands or be able to lease out this right and become workers elsewhere. In other words, they cannot usually be dispossessed. At the same time, they can use this right as security or insurance in seeking other source of livelihood and enterprise. Thus, critical to this success is the earlier system of collective rights to land. Indeed, this kind of collective rights may not only be traced to socialist policies, but perhaps still earlier to differentiated concept of land use rights to be found, for instance, in Chen Hansheng's research of surface and subsoil rights. If you have questions, we can go into that. In other words, people may have benefited from the historical conception of rights to land use, which is different from the modern conception of rationalized and absolute property rights. Although the weight of TVs is declining in present-day China, it is important to understand the role they played in facilitating economic development by working with community norms. These enterprises emerged from the needs of TV governments, which began to receive reduced subsidies and grants from higher levels of government to take care of their social welfare needs. Like all other units, these local governments needed to generate their own income. TVs were expected to put aside a sum for communal welfare. Since they were collective enterprises producing for the market, whether or not they worked in them, villagers had a right in them and an interest in increasing the collective income. Additionally, TV managers and village cadres were critical middlemen negotiating between the needs of these community enterprises and state agents. Thus, TV possessed important characteristics of protective brokerages. At the same time, market considerations shaped the behavior of both managers as well as individual workers because rewards were correlated with performance of the enterprise. Conclusion, finally. The cultural nexus of power, which is a zone of symbolically embedded interactions, allowed communication, negotiation, accommodation, entrepreneurship, legitimation strategies for local leadership, and the regeneration of community values. However, is only possible when there are relatively stable, although not face-to-face, communities. We have noted the extent to which the Guanxi model of Chinese entrepreneurship, also readily evident in Southeast Asia, with its transitive networks of familiarity, can extend far and wide. While its horizontal scope with layered links to different levels of the formal system is expandable, it is not infinitely so. Thus, its qualities and capacities are significantly different from the legal model of contractual relations underpinned by modern state law. This is perhaps one reason why, with the appearance of large-scale, capital-intensive agribusinesses in rural society, the entrepreneurial model, including the TVs, is rapidly diminishing in importance. I'm not trying to suggest that China should depend upon the small-scale rural capitalism that I have described here. It is evident that China has and will need to continue to scale up the value chain of global production in many sectors of the economy. Nonetheless, the historical and creative entrepreneurialism that I have pointed to has served the gradual opening of Chinese society to market reforms very well and could continue to service the economic and social needs of rural people. As I see it, there are three threats to this vibrancy of community capitalism. The first is the historical problem of governance that we've identified since the Qing period, with the tendency for unregulated and unsupervised local authorities to increase their predatory demands. In an age of each tub on its own bottom, the pressure to increase production, profits, and taxes at the cost of all else is particularly great. The second is the tendency for large-scale capital to come in from outside and wipe out local enterprise, your big box phenomenon, right, and initiatives through the sheer scale of their operations. Finally, there's the problem of the hollowing out of village communities. As the able-bodied workers migrate to the cities in such vast numbers, the very fabric of family and society is becoming eroded, a phenomenon that was noted even in the Republic by Fei Xiaotong and others. With the diminishment of state demands on the village and the growing perception of it as in need of assistance, the impact of predatory state brokers may also be diminishing. So, agricultural taxes were removed in 2005, and that has, I think, had an effect, although different regions have had varied experiences. In many regions of China, the threat to the cultural nexus and community is perhaps less from these sources than from big capital and outmigration, leaving many villages as the shells of former selves, occupied by the most vulnerable segments of the population, old people, children, and young women with children. In response to this type of impoverishment of economic and cultural strength, the new rural reform movements, harking back to the reform movements of Liang Shuming and Jimmy Yen from the 20s and 30s, these are movements led by people like Wan Tiejun and others, are seeking to regenerate villages not merely through provisioning economic and social services, but also by trying to rebuild social and cultural relationships and values through cooperative projects that function within market society. Apparently, there are areas of success in this reformist endeavor, but the scope of these efforts is still very limited. How the state moves in this direction is critical. For instance, the recent property legislation, I think last November or December, exactly a year ago, which seeks to transform the land use rights of villagers into absolute property rights, could have disastrous consequences for village as a moral corporate body and further unravel the cultural nexus. The combined power of predatory officials and big capital to unfairly expropriate individual landowners may be irresistible. The new laws remain suspended in a liminal zone at the moment. Many areas have simply ignored it and nobody's pushing it. The question facing the reformers is how to create new institutions that will sustain creativity in local society and prevent the negative impact of the old and new threats. How can they fashion a rule of law that is sensitive to local community norms and practices? How can they empower local communities to supervise and regulate these local structures of power? The reforms have brought China a great way towards economic growth and citizens' welfare. They should also look to protect the community and cultural structures that have enabled many of these developments. Thank you. Sorry it takes so long.
Thank you very much, Prasenjit, for this most rich presentation, and then also delivered at high speed. All right, it's a very condensed piece of presentation. It's always, of course, a surprise to get to the conclusion of any of Prasenjit's work. But then, of course, yet again, he demonstrates to our satisfaction how that it's always rewarding or exciting to follow his line of thinking. Now, I should say that, first of all, I mean, it's I suppose I've always suspected from the very beginning, that is, with my reading of his first book on North China villages, that his sympathy not only lies with the villagers, but also with villagers with faith, that is, religious beliefs, and above all, villagers with religious beliefs actually living under a socialist arrangement when it comes to choice of stage. And this appears to be a presentation which, in the most succinct form, brings all these elements together and presents to us at the very end of his paper how that all three factors, namely temple communities, village communities, that is cultural nexus operative at the rural level, and then also the broader environment of socialist state, could come together and work miracles, wonderful things. But then, let me unpack that for a little bit, and then maybe pose a couple of questions. So there are three main points which I get out of Prasenjit's high-speed presentation. A, the competence of the Chinese central government in creating or in presiding over an environment which is by and large favorable to reform. And this is an environment that includes two features. One, when the central state embarks upon reform, it does so in an incremental way. And then it does so without upsetting their predecessors. In other words, by calling it restoration or almost restorative to the primordial doctrines of the party, that these reformers achieved revolutionary outcome without calling it a revolution. Hence, they managed to negotiate that delicate transition between the Chinese Communist Party's past and present in a historical sense. Secondly, the Central Chinese government has been extremely competent in managing its international environment. It insists upon this being a peaceful rise of China. It insists upon the deconnection or de-association between political and economic issues. And by doing so, it avoids some of these characteristic pitfalls that accompanies the rise of major powers and ended up presiding over an environment in which peace, if not stability, could be hoped for China as a whole. But then, of course, the central government is relatively remote in Prasenjit's presentation. It makes its presence felt in the countryside only through the second phase or a second feature that made this provincial or local authority critical in rural societies, namely that under socialism after 1949, the PRC has been able to build the kind of mechanism for mobilization. Initially, these were mechanisms built for political mobilization, and yet nonetheless, with such mechanisms in place, the PRC as a state is unique in the sense that it has the capacity for the center to access and to mobilize resources and personnel at the local level. So in that sense, namely institutionally and organizationally, economics and politics are domestically linked while internationally separated. All the better for the wonderful achievement of the PRC government. Now, a second feature there, or a second point there that appears to be interesting or important is something like this. Now, I've lost my note. Where is it? Okay, it's here. So the second point here is, the second point that's important here is this. Namely, the reform started in the 1870s in the countryside. So here, Prasenjit essentially presents us with a picture of China's economic transformation, which has the capacity of growing from bottom up. And much of his discussion, in fact, is an effort to explore both the potential and the political ramifications or consequences of such a bottom-up approach to economic reform. But then to get to that point or to answer those questions, it's also necessary to first answer the question why it had been possible for the PRC to be so successful starting out with the TVEs and economic reform in the countryside. So here he offers us a combination of two things. One, it's because, I've already mentioned, it's because the Socialist Party has built this institutional mechanism, making it possible for the state to reach all the way down to the countryside. And then two, even more luckily, from Ming Qing onward, there had always been the existence of, or been operative in the countryside, these temple societies or these cultural nexus, which of course had been instrumental with the revival or relaxation of party control over religious matters, had made it possible for rural communities to build their own communities simultaneously of three things. One is trust. That is, when it comes to economic transactions, it's necessary to have trust, and this trust has been mediated through temple communities becomes possible. And then secondly, through this trust, these local temple communities also becomes a community of shared credit, that is economic credit. And thirdly, without the state, formally legislating on issues of contract or even the courts going into economic enforcement in local areas. A third factor that comes into play, assuring trust in credit transactions in the cultural or spiritual temple communities in the countryside, is the shared factor about faith. In other words, there is a certain element of spirituality. It's the all-powerful deities as well as the rituals coming along to help enforce the combination of faith, trust, and credit, hence enabling the dynamic engagement of local communities in market activities. All right, so with these two things coming along happily, then of course we move on to the final result of Prasenjit's conclusion, namely it's the kind of transition or transformation of the Chinese countryside 30 years down the line from the day of reform. Essentially for this civic community or civil society based on shared rituals and worship to step in to fill the space left behind by the state, with the state withdrawing from social welfare at the communal level. And these communities of faith are simultaneously communities of shared economic interest, because under socialism, after all, people have been given this understanding that collectively everyone has a claim to the use of the land, which of course is the basis of the new wealth. And then thirdly, of course, this is a community which is now, it offers each other social welfare. It acknowledges each other's economic rights to the land. And thirdly, above all, it's assured by this common faith or ritual practice through temple society that it has its basic foundation for trust, for credit, as well as for faith. So on the basis of that, Prasenjit argues, it's now possible to talk about a second tier or a parallel level of organization in Chinese countryside that's capable of looking after itself. It inherits, in some ways, some of these critical traits, both from imperial China and from socialist China. And obviously, it's going to march into a future that's market-oriented, but it's market-oriented without becoming socialist. It's democratic without giving up on socialism. In other words, it's social democracy of a rooted and lended sort of healthy culture, and then also at the heart of it all, it's centered upon notions of family, familial obligations, as well as lineage relationship. In other words, it's a face-to-face, people-to-people relationship. Now that is my reading of this picture that Prasenjit is painting for us about wonderful China, which I have no objection, except that, I'm happy to hear that this is happening, except that I might have a couple of questions. So about the questions.
Sure.
All right. So the first set of questions, Prasenjit, is this. You labored over the issue of scale of this economy. In other words, this TVE on the basis of this personalized community of trust, credit, and faith, and how that this scale of economy might be able to reach beyond wherever that it happens to be located. My question to you in some ways is exactly that. Namely, even though the Chinese reform started out with rural reform, it ended up, every bit of it, as a movement towards urbanization. It's pushing people into the cities, and the state is facilitating such a process with policy measures. So what do we do then in this case about the dynamics between the bottom-up rural economic communal, rurally based economic communal dynamics versus the state-driven, urban-centered and globalizing scale of economics? Well, it's just the connection or the disconnection between the country and the city. The second question here is that you presented a picture of late imperial China plus socialism gifting the post-reform PRC all these wonderful traits. Now, my question to you is this. Post the Ming-Qing China or late imperial China and post-1849 China, how well do they coexist with each other, either before 1878 or after 1878? Don't they not attack each other a little bit sometimes? Or perhaps even after 1878, that they coexist in ways which transform both and then ended up rendering neither or the way that they were supposed to be. In other words, would it not be possible for, say, the local temple head to happen to be the party cadre, or vice versa? I mean, they are the party cadre. In other words, for the mixing of the systems to take place, in other words, the coexistence, right, of different remnants of the past, making it neither possible to inherit that history, nor would it be possible for that history or for some sort of a new mixture not to happen. So if the party cadre turn out to be the temple head. Now, what kind of local nexus or cultural nexus are we talking about? The cultural nexus of the Longwang or the cultural nexus of Chairman Mao, for instance?
Wouldn't the nexus of the party Longwang?
The party Longwang. That's totally possible. I'm thinking of an episode offered by this scholar at Beida, Chen Jianhua, who offered the case of Nanjie, right? Nanjie in the Hebei countryside, which came across as very much a socialist sort of village by choice. But then this was a socialist village by choice attaining its peace and prosperity thanks to the mediation of the party secretary and the party infrastructure. Anyway, so I'm sure you know my question. And my third question to you, of course, is simply this. Prasenjit, the very last question here was respond to your final image of that wonderful, shall we say, the happy present or the happy future, is that you mentioned that, you alluded to that point as well, that is, with the out-migration of the able-bodied people, is there not the danger of these villages becoming hollowed out, right? Now, it's not just a question of these villages becoming hollowed out. It's migration as such, as well as influx, right, of influences, factors, forces coming from the outside. In other words, given the spatial dynamics and mobility of today's China, aided, enhanced by the use of capital, technology, information, right, of all sorts, and facilitating out-migration as well as immigration of a variety of sorts. I mean, where would you find that stable ground on which one might happily ground this community of faith, of shared communal rights, and then also shared communal economic rights and mutual welfare that you are presenting. So those are my 3 questions. Thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you. I have a mic. I'm sure there are lots of other questions too, but let me quickly try and address your comments. First, thank you for your summary. I think I hope they helped people for whom my presentation was too fast. I think you did cover. It was
very fast for me.
cover some of the important points. On very rapid sort of response to your last 3 questions, you really you actually have depicted me as painting such a rosy picture that I have to rethink this paper. I didn't realize that it was as rosy. It was more the cultural nexus that I thought was being rosied out. But and perhaps the transition to perhaps there should be a clearer statement of the problems too, which lead to my conclusion, where in fact there is a hollowing out and there are other impact on this village and so on. And I think your 3 questions really speak to really the same issues is what is happening now with the first one is the urban centricness and out-migration and things like that. And I wish I could say that I can make a coherent narrative that till the 1990s, these villages, I mean, China's a big place, right? So there are differences between coastal and interior, and how much am I talking about interior and how much am I talking about coastal. And this is a general essay, and it's clearly not based on specific research, but other people's research. So that is going to be a problem, and I should look at it. But the narrative I would like to invoke is that till the turn of the century, of the present century, I think we still had rural communities doing relatively well. First through income and relatively healthy, and that they were able to do this. With the WTO and just before and after, you get the big sort of attraction of investments in the coastal cities, and you do get this huge out-migration, which then produces the hollowing out effect. And I think that then that leads to sort of a combination of issues, and clearly the rural areas were suffering a lot, both because of the decline as well as the growth of agribusiness in the rural areas, and which is why, and then the political demands, right? I mean, these predatory brokers who at every step would demand more from villagers and so on, which led the central government, here I should invoke the central government, to give up on all taxes on the rural areas. And that's not to say that, there's still no demands made, especially when they want to appropriate land and engage in land grab and so on. All that still happens in the rural areas, of course. But most observers seem to indicate that there has been a much lesser growth of this predatory demand. There are also not that many people left in the villages who can sort of contribute the income anymore, right? So so my answer there is that my narrative should be able to address some of those issues, that the problems now are greater, and it's both a problem, it's now but less a problem of tax demands and other demands as much as a problem of how to in fact, if the active producers are not there in the village, then what happens to all this community and so on, right? But your other question of how do they coexist, I think I tried through the idea of this creative entrepreneurialism. I think it's looking at the work of people like Adam Chow and all this work on Southeast China and so on. It seems to be increasingly the case that rural cadres have now turned towards villages and turned away from the party structure. I mean, you still need the party affiliation to have contacts with the township. Actually, township is getting increasingly hollowed out itself politically, but county authorities and so on to make sure that, they can preserve these relations. But Adam Chow shows that almost that most of the temple leaders are also party cadres, but they use this very much for the temple community and so on, and to negotiate their position with the party. The party status is important to negotiate protection from the party. So it's a kind of protective brokerage, I think I would say. And it's also much more developed, I think. I think the temple communities are far more powerful than the party in the southeast. These ritual alliances and things like that, when you look at that. So there, it doesn't seem to be much of a problem. But of course, I'm sure there are areas where it is, and where, there's a greater preference still for collectivist structures and so on, for socialist collectivist structures over these temple communities. So I'll just leave it at that. And
could I follow up with just one question, and then we'll open up to the floor? I mean, I suppose in a way, right? One could argue that there's not a credit shortage in China today, and there are plenty of multiple centers of faith or multiple practices of faith. But then when it comes to Chinese capitalism with socialist characteristics, there is one profound and serious crisis, which is universal all across China, which is a crisis of trust, right? There is a complete absence of trust in public places, especially in areas concerning economic activities. So on issues of whether you report truthfully on your SARS incidents, on powdered milk quality, or powdered milk, whatever. So there is and then of course, when it comes to officials, there are issues of corruption. So given that, my question to you is, Prasenjit, in what ways do you think that your descriptive or analytical model would have the capacity to explain the overall situation of China as a whole without presenting us eventually a somewhat polarized picture, namely that there are party secretaries turning themselves to face the villages, whereas there are also other people, maybe the central government or whatnot, a different batch of people operating in urban centers. And there might be some sort of a disconnect between
In fact, not only is there a disconnect, I think that my argument can also work towards what you're saying. That is to say, if the TV is concerned in the community and produced in the community, it may not matter that the product that it produces may not work after a little while, right? And so, that could become very much more internally. So you're right. I mean, I have ended up probably, let's see what the others say, romanticizing, but there are all these things and there is a sort of a very negative side to local community powering as well. All I started out was saying was that entrepreneurship was possible because of this, and it became hugely romanticized, right?
Right. So
maybe I should. All I wanted to say was that local entrepreneurship, the energies, were possible because of these historical traditions.
Well, all you want to say is you have a soft spot for the peasants, especially for the Dragon King worshipping peasants. All right.
Okay.
All right, please.
Let's open it up.
All right, let's open it up. Margaret, please.
Thank you very much for your talk. We always read your books in Professor Ye's class, and it's enlightening to hear you speak today. I have a question which is maybe a less sophisticated version of Professor Ye's comments, but I just want to ask for further elaboration on how the cultural nexus of power functions in the countryside. And from my limited understanding of how things work in imperial China, it seems that local elites try to entrench themselves in positions of power. And it would seem that if local communities are conducive to fostering entrepreneurship, and if there's this sort of local community with a social fabric and shared faith, that would create further incentives to keep these entrepreneurs within that framework of that cultural nexus. So I guess I'm asking what makes today, the sort of post-reform cultural nexus function differently, so that local elites no longer want to entrench themselves in the countryside, but rather are being pushed toward the cities. So basically, just how that internal dynamic of the cultural nexus is functioning, and how it would take into account maybe a different set of impetuses for the people who emerge from them today than in previous systems.
Yeah, I think that clearly, after some people start doing very well, they begin to access the modern sectors of the economy, right? They begin to get loans from banks and from there, and often they're Kwanshi connections within the government system and so on. And one of the big things to do is then acquire land and so on. So there is a much greater risk of the system eroding from within, which is, I think, what you're pointing to. And much greater opportunities available for local capitalists and local property owners and so on. And that is the case, but so that you're fighting in some ways a losing battle, and that's what happened. A lot of these successful TVs and so on are now the owners of agribusinesses, who are buying out very much the very people who they. But so what I'm trying to suggest is that for those who are left behind, it's very important that they still have their collective rights, right? Or their rights embedded in the collective village. And that is what is also being eroded. And this is what these intellectual reformers, right? These rural reform people are trying to trying to redevelop from this Wan Tiejun and all these other people. What's his other guy's name? Chang Shu. Does anybody know? Huh? Chang Shu Kwang, yeah. And people like that. I'm told that Wan Tiejun has had to give up his village. and not so much because of state or anything, but because the local farmers didn't agree with the way he was trying to develop which is also an interesting issue. Once again, you have these outside intellectuals coming in telling you how to create cooperatives and this, that, and the. On the other hand, several of these seem to have worked very well, though it's, of course, still a tiny drop in the bucket. One of the interesting things to look at is, how the state is also, the local government is also supposedly now invested in. Because, of course, recently what has happened is the Chinese government, first they stopped the taxes, and then they put in these billions. At this point, it's mainly to get them to buy washing machines and things like that, so they can get the economy to go. But there is all this money that's being put into the rural area, and the local governments are also interested in creating sort of cooperative schemes and other kinds of community organizations and so on as a way to look at it. But I think you're right that the dynamic here is sufficiently, and maybe this is the interesting point, that it is not something that is sustainable. The cultural nexus is not something sustainable because the logic of capital, of course, moves it away from local community. But that needn't necessarily be the case. I mean, after all, that was the critique of capital that was made by people like Polanyi and so on, that, you've had capital all this while. It's when big finance capital moves in that you get a certain kind of erosion. So, and I think we've reached a point in history when people have to think about those issues in China and in the US.
Other questions?
Just about the crude demography. What percentage of the population
She's audible.
What percentage of the population actually farms in, let's say, 1900, 1950, 2010?
Probably it's a dramatic 2010, which is, now what do they say? Over 65, 70%, 65% of the Chinese population is moving into the urban areas. And of course, the farming level had probably declined massively, even within the rural areas.
People who are still in villages, or what
Yeah.
you generally call villages, but people who are actually farming, the percentage.
I don't know. I don't have the figures, but I doubt if it's more than 20, 25%.
Yeah. And
Whereas it was closer to 80, 85% 100 years ago.
Right.
Well, your favorite Japanese comparison becomes interesting, right? Because
Yeah.
in the Meiji period, it's about 80%.
Yes.
And at the end of the Pacific War,
Yeah.
it's about 50%
Yes.
farming.
Exactly.
And now it's way under 5%.
Yeah. Yeah.
So this is a shared trajectory.
Yeah.
I think there are communal nexuses that are preservable in certain sorts of worlds.
Yeah.
They're usually totalitarian in their way. You see it in a lot of Japanese cities.
Yeah.
I mean, the emergency patrols, the fire patrols, whatever.
Yeah.
There are ways of maintaining this, and it's pretty attractive. But
Yeah.
it has to do with the social organization from above. This is
Sure.
not, a neighborhood kind of
Yeah.
generation.
Exactly. In fact, one of the most interesting things was, and when I was in Japan in the 80s, was to see that despite these big box supermarkets and so on, you still had a lot of mom and pop stores, right?
Yeah.
And I don't think you have them anymore.
Sure you do, but the trajectory is down, 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 down. So
Yeah.
I think there's a limited.
But there
life.
was a law that kept them going even through the 70s and 80s. There were laws.
But there are neighborhood laws around here.
Yeah, sure.
Right. How in the Elmwood district, how
Yeah.
many eateries can you have? How many? They're trying to artificially enforce the same sort of thing. And how
Yeah.
many chains can you have?
Yeah.
So socialist government or socialist leaning government can do a lot. I'm all.
Well, that's the issue. That's the issue in China. I mean, once you, in a sense, you don't yet have the issue of how many agribusinesses can you have and so on. I mean, that's not up for political legislation in China. But what is up for political legislation is, can you dispossess these people? I mean, not dispossess them. Can you give them absolute property rights so that they can dispossess themselves? And the Chinese government, I think, has dual thinking on this, that just forget about the countryside. Let's, get everybody's going to be part of, 90% of the population is going to be part of the Japan story, right, of the urban areas. So
But
let's sort of...
There's still heavy-duty land taxation, as you know. Is there any other state in the modern world that's canceled agrarian taxes?
As China?
Yeah.
But so many of these advanced industrial societies don't really charge that. In fact, in the US, it's the reverse, right? You give so much subsidy that it's now bigger than the total agricultural income produced in Mexico, or something, some 300 billion or something. And that's the problem with the Doha rounds and so on, that it's not only done that, it's sort of giving all these things. So, yeah, it's interesting how these issues get completely tied up to global issues, doesn't it?
It does. You have a question?
It's hard to sustain the cultural nexus in that world.
Next question. Anyone? Right.
So, is this on?
Yeah.
So with the collapse of the former Soviet bloc countries, there's all this stuff about how there is a rise of civil society, a suppressed tradition of civil society. But when you were talking earlier on, you had mentioned Ken Dean's book,
Kenneth Dean.
the 3-in-1, and you had said specifically that this kind of scenario that you were talking about was not about the rise of civil society. You couldn't understand them in terms of civil society structures. So then the question is, first of all, how would you characterize this in theoretical terms.
Yeah.
And the second bit is, when you were talking about these temples, I assume they're mostly Taoist temples rather than Buddhist temples. If they are Taoist temples or a mixture of them, can you say a little bit more about what is it about these religions that make them amenable to these these structures of marketization?
Okay. Yeah, no, they're not. Your first question was civil society. If it's not civil society, what is it? If it's not civil society, it's cultural nexus. There was a whole debate in the Chinese history field, which in just after the East European things broke out, and William Rowe said, "Oh, there was civil society in China," and Fred and people sort of, jumped down and said, "No, it's an authoritarian thing," and I tried to make a minor remediation there, saying that it was supposed to be, that there was always what Philip Huang calls a third realm. But what was interesting for me was that this third realm at the end of the 19th century was begun to be thought of as a civil society. It didn't work. It didn't last. They tried to reorganize and mobilize it as such. But it didn't work. And so really we're left with a non-concept concept, which is the third realm. And but the way I see it much more, by suggesting that it's cultural nexus, it's the cultural nexus is also a horribly underspecified concept, and partly that's why people have found it useful, because it's underspecified, right? But it's a realm of negotiation, accommodation, and creation of local leadership through utilization of each other's resources and so on, state-society kinds of resources, and it seems like that's back here, so that you give some, you take some. You're not predisposed to protecting this society from state intrusion, which is the dominant notion of this, or at least the way in which it's been characterized, probably relevant only for a very small realm of Western society, but nonetheless, that's the ideal typical sort of image that has emerged from there. So that's one. So, there's no real answer to that. Your second question was regarding what? Taoism. This is the thing that we really don't have. You should come to my talk tomorrow, because what I try to suggest there, that the whole concept of religion, is a misnomer in Chinese society, and it's dependent very much on Abrahamic ideas of faith as central to religion, right? And so you have to have something with a body of ideas that you can call Taoism, and with a church possibly, or with an institution and so on. Whereas in fact, the power of Chinese society has been popular religion, which has been entirely syncretic. So all these guys are completely syncretic, and a lot of it is what Charles Taylor calls human flourishing. You just want another baby, you worship this god. If it doesn't deliver, you worship another. Who has more ling, who has none, right? So, but it has a very interesting structure. It's absorptive. It's practical. Precisely because it's not dominated by clerics and Buddhist Taoists and so on. They come, occasionally perform some services. If they're efficacious, then they brought back again. If they're not, away with you, right? So there is a certain power to this, and they have this 3-in-1, 5-in-1. Everything can be absorbed in this kind of thing, and that's why I think in part it's been so well adapted to the different needs of these societies.
Could I follow up on that? That is, Prasenjit. So how then would you fit into your overall picture this piece of information, namely that nearly 20% of China's population has declared themselves to be Christians, that is either Protestant or Catholics. And Chinese Communist Party leader complained that there are more Christians in China than communists.
I think it's a very interesting issue. I think it's something that still has to be, people engage in religion for various different reasons. But when you say 20%, I think faith is an important part, and Christianity comes with faith. Incidentally, this is not new. Tachibana Shiraki, of the architect of Manchukuo ideology, said the first thing he says is that Christianity is the fastest growing religion in China in the 1930s and 40s. So it's been there for a long time. We all know what the Taipings did, right? But what is very interesting is how even Christianity in China, especially at the popular level, is a very interesting mediation of faith and efficacy. I mean, think of the Taipings. The Taipings had a very strong concept of faith, and they would destroy all of the... But at the same time, what was the medium with? They used spirit mediumship for authority, right? I mean, this fellow would go into a trance and he would start speaking in tongues and so on, which is exactly what, what is called Fuji and Fulan and so on is, right? So, I mean, there's a very interesting sort of combination of practices. And I think if the Christian God doesn't deliver, they'll look for others.
Come on.
Well, let's see. The whole business about Abrahamic thing is that you're not supposed to look for others because you're prepared to give up your son. It's belief with a capital B. But maybe a lot of them will do it. But I think we'll see.
We'll see. All right.
It really depends on how it's institutionalized also. I mean, is there going to be a powerful clerical group that can have certain kind of power over the flock? Mm-hmm. And that really has a lot to do with Chinese. I don't think there's anything intrinsic or anything. It's the historical institutional development.
Mm-hmm. This is Bolanger.
Yeah.
Just curious about how you comment on regions where are troubled by actually their lack of entrepreneurialism and the lack of culture nexus. For example, like inland China, rural Henan, rural Hebei, rural Shanxi, including Dingxian, where Wen Tiejun, has been doing his experiments. It's still very, very poor, because we know quite well about the penetration of the state apparatus, but the resurgence of culture nexus is still quite mysterious for me. I mean, I understand in southeastern China and what you'll be talking about. I mean, the temple. Cultures and stuff, but in inland China, for example, if we read Cao Jinqing's, 黄河边的中国, he's talking about the fragmentation of rural society, and what he saw is not much different from, Liang Suming's, China, and that's also why Wen Tiejun and that school of people are trying to kind of rebuild the community of rural China. Because it was still, overall, we tend to say China has a very weak civil society or whatever you call it. So why, so how, so is it just simply, Guanxi? So this so-called culture nexus you've been talking about, I'm still kind of, I
think a very, it may be quite exceptional, but I was very, I reinforced my ideas about this cultural nexus. I think in Southeast China it works very well. But in North China, I was a little concerned that, maybe it hasn't, or if it has developed, it hasn't certainly led to any economic growth and so on, or any vibrancy. But looking at Adam Chow's book, of course, he's looking at a certain area. You see that there is but ironically, there's a lot of activities happening, right? The guy created the same temple leader, created reforestation projects. He created... the other thing that happens is that more and more, there's a new emergence, which is religion as tourism, right? And you almost use popular religion and popular culture, or some cadres use it to get people to visit there and see these customs and things like that, which is a different way of doing it, but that's also one of the, it's not intrinsic to this. But I don't think I have the expertise to say why in certain areas it does develop and why in other areas it doesn't. I think it probably has to do with the exodus of people, with maybe they never had much commercialism in North China across there as well, but the other structures needed for, say, irrigation communities and so on, which are often very important in reintroducing both culture and economic activity, are not there. I wouldn't have an answer to why it does or doesn't. Maybe Liu Xin has some response or question.
My impression is that although you said something like apparatus of mobilization, you gave really a great historical significance to the Maoist revolution. But the impression I receive, especially from your conclusion, is that revolution did nothing. Whenever the opportunity arises, the traditional communal, spirit will come back to become the entrepreneur again, to lead the reform, or this is actually only an impression. I don't know, whether it's
I don't agree with that, but maybe after you finish.
Yeah, this is actually the thing, the first thing. The second thing, you started with Meiji restoration.
Yeah.
But the content of a paper seems to show Japanese and Chinese development are totally different. Because one is actually returning to the almost, in the Chinese side, would be a feudal type of family sort of production. The other one is actually developed into really a big corporate type. But my true question here is actually this, the whole material you use and present is actually built upon the 1980s experience of Chinese economic development. But everyone is now talking about the break China actually took from mid-1990s onwards. Then the whole world would become quite different. Huge banks and all these oil companies and all these kind of things. And also all these overseas students and scholars going back, setting up high-tech companies and so on and so forth. This picture is totally out of the presentation. Would this kind of later phase of the 30 years be also fit into the picture you provided?
No, but that's the thrust of my narrative. Let me try and recapture the three questions. The first one was what? Say that again. I can't remember anymore. I'm getting quite old.
The significance of the Maoist revolution.
Oh, the Maoist revolution to mobilization, right? No, I don't mean to say that Maoist mobilization was useful for producing a revolutionary thing. My argument is precisely that the Maoist mobilization is useful as primitive capital accumulation. Because this is what I'm trying to argue, that it's good for the reform period because you can move labor around, you can move people around in certain kinds of ways, right? So that was one. Maybe from the young people.
No, his question is also, right, that is, so you presented a picture of the Maoist revolution being able to penetrate straight into the countryside. And yet you also argue, or seem to be arguing, that the minute that we get to 1978, that all the pre-1949 stuff pops up all over again. So was there a revolution or was there no revolution?
No. I mean, I make the argument that the hukou system and so on did, in fact, that you did have a lot of collectivist structures, that you tied people to the land, and you did have the re-inhabitation of the production teams and brigades and so on to this. I mean, for its purposes, it certainly reached much more to people than did any other rural society at this point. You did have production teams, brigades, and so on. Nobody else ever achieved anywhere near that, right? I mean, the fact that it didn't work was another matter, but it did penetrate, and it is an instrument that very few third world societies have been able to develop. But your other points were
Meiji comparison, that he thinks that.
I think, and that's related to this point. I think what I wanted to say was precisely that things changed precisely from the mid-1990s. It is a study of the successes of the early reform for which we are indebted to this kind of thing. And what happens? I mean, I don't know what happens to the Meiji rural sector and how much that involves. But I think this fellow from Princeton, what's his name? David Howell. I think he tried to make, I just heard a lecture once, he tried to make an argument, a similar type of argument, that there were all kinds of continuities of structures and so on that were of rural society and local society and so on that suddenly took off again with the early Meiji. And is that not what he argued?
I think the rural situation would be pretty hard to represent optimistically in Taisho Showa.
But he does, right?
No, well, I haven't heard that one.
He has a new book on that stuff. Well, entrepreneurship. I'm not.
Talking about somebody else.
No, it's about entrepreneurship that he wants to argue that Tokugawa Japan had a lot of incredible entrepreneurship going. That was released also, rural entrepreneurship going. That was released also after 1868.
But we're not talking primarily about the agrarian sector.
Yeah.
In that case.
Okay.
Which is a side of landlordism.
Sure.
In the most vicious and extreme. Here you have the seed of the right-wing chauvinism in the extreme because of the misery of that situation.
So in a sense, this sort of makes my point that it's not so much that Japan went to pure capitalism and so on. It actually had much more of landlordism at that point in the story. Whereas here, I think it's the next 15 years, I think, that we begin to see the kind of... So it's part of that trajectory which will lead to the expansion of capitalism, but it's really the spirit in between that I want to argue for. And my narrative is precisely that this has enabled all this and is being decimated from within, with still a lot of losers, and... what can one do either to... And as I said, I think the Chinese government is split on this, in that it wants to, help whatever is left there, because... and from that perspective, it's more important. Maybe they're doing it just because they're afraid of rural uprisings and so on, which is certainly the case. But at the same time, they also want to try and move as many people out of the rural areas, I think, and lead to urbanization. So I don't think my narrative is incompatible with, and it does not, I'm talking about what contributed to the, I should say, early successes of the reform period.
Well, I suppose we've reached the 6 o'clock hour, and we should probably give our speaker a little rest. I might want to end up with one question, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
Okay, and then we'll give you a rest. And it's a question perhaps that involves stepping back a little bit to a more macro historical or narratological level. Because I was struck and very interested in the phrase you used, socialist primitive accumulation. I've actually had an experience of meeting with local officials in southeast China, in Zhejiang, and finding that although in many ways they seem very much like gangsters, they were very fluent in the language of the Marxist narrative of capitalist development. That is, they referred to their own activities as primitive accumulation. Right? It's fascinating. It's quite interesting, right? And it seems to me that the whole story you're telling is actually a story that it's a story of a world historical emergence of a new kind of capitalism, or
socialist primitive accumulation,
whatever that may be. But it's quite interesting.
Socialist accumulation with Chinese characteristics.
Correct. And actually, your paper comes in the context of a number of scholars who are trying to figure this thing out, right? I think of, for instance, Giovanni Arrighi's recent book, Adam Smith in Beijing, which makes some arguments about Chinese capitalism being, in some sense, a new form of capitalism, one which has some sort of internal buffering, right? The buffering of the hukou system, the buffering of the socialist legacy, which prevents it from being quite as predatory as earlier types of capitalism. So I wonder, one, whether you find that kind of account convincing, and two, whether or not the kind of language or the kind of narratives of earlier accounts of the rise of capitalism or capitalism development are constraining our account of what's happening now. So, for instance, if we think of the imminent elimination of the hukou system, that seems to be...
Immolation.
That too. Do we then have to put that in terms of a new sort of enclosure act, right? If you talk about the accumulation of capital by TVEs, primitive accumulation actually the correct term to use? And finally, in your account, it's quite interesting that one term which usually structures most accounts of capitalist development is utterly missing, and that's the bourgeoisie, right? Use the word once. So I'm kind of curious about these issues of vocabulary and what's the appropriate kind of terminology to describe.
He said he would ask a small question.
I'm sorry, that is a big question.
Bourgeoisie.
I have a mic. No, I like your. Now I have a double mic, so I can. I like your world historical sort of narrative and what it means. Unfortunately, I haven't read. I only read the first chapter of Arrighi's book, so I haven't got. Somebody told me that his old world system stuff is good, but the new stuff on China is very weak, so I didn't read it. But maybe I should, since he's making arguments that seem to be interesting to me. But I think that's precisely what, I mean, it is this, and maybe the word is not, or maybe it is primitive socialist accumulation with Chinese characteristics, because after all, what is going on, the Chinese characteristics here would be the fact that you have a hukou system, the fact that you have villagers who can still, use their existing socialist structures and their collective rights and things like that. So maybe that is the point. What it does, of course, is that it completely, as you rightly suggest, throws the existing accounts of emergent entrepreneurship, right? I mean, which is a very powerful narrative of all time, especially as the sort of the neoliberal account develops upon it, right? That you need, and it'd be interesting to sort of visit this with people like who we're talking about, Schumpeter and things like that. What does it suggest? Because for them there was a very little role for the state, and for I think Polanyi might be much more interesting in this respect, and it could be very interesting to revisit Polanyi with the Chinese case in mind. I think he might provide the most assistance for us to understand how entrepreneurship develops. But, I do also agree that after a while, these things begin, there's a lot of pressure on these existing sort of enabling structures, as it were, to erode, given the power of capitalism, given what it tends to do, and the profit motive. So thank you.
Let's end with the profit motive.
So let me just say, let me just say that it seems to me that, Prasenjit, you have offered us a historicized narrative with broad relevance in many areas. This is informed in your reading of theory of history, and then also of comparisons in other parts of the world. As Andrew's question has brought it out, we are trying to describe a phenomenon which is of such exciting potential, and it's happening right before our eyes, and yet about which we do not really have ready-made vocabulary for it. So as you are discussing, I want to complain about the hardship that I had to endure trying to figure out what to say. And then I want to thank you for offering a way to focus our thinking. It's been extremely stimulating.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you all for your comments and questions.
And thank you to Professor Ye for her discussion.